October 1944. The wind off the North Sea cut like a knife across the Dutch coast, carrying the sharp scent of salt and gunpowder. In a muddy trench, Major Jack Morrison stared through the rain at a fortress that looked more like a monster than a building, 12 feet of solid concrete, bristling with machine guns, rising from the seawall like a gray, unbreakable tooth. Just 200 yards away, that fortress had become the single deadliest obstacle in the entire Allied campaign. Behind Morrison, 34 wooden crosses stood in the mud, each one marking a Canadian soldier who died in just 3 days, all for a few yards of ground. 34 families back home would soon receive the telegram every military family dreads: "We regret to inform you." But this wasn't just another battle. This fortress was the key to everything. 30 miles away, the port of Antwerp waited, Europe's second largest harbor, the lifeline for the Allied armies pushing toward Germany. Without Antwerp, American tanks sat idle, artillery ran out of shells, and wounded soldiers went without medicine. Every day the fortress held 4,000 tons of supplies piled up uselessly, while the front lines starved for fuel and ammunition. The entire Allied advance was frozen in place, all because of one concrete stronghold and the man inside it. Inside those walls, Major Klaus Richter commanded 180 German soldiers, each one ready to fight to the last bullet. Richter had sent a message to the Canadians that was as cold as the October rain. "I am a German officer. I do not negotiate with liberators who are invaders. My men will fight to the last bullet. You may waste your soldiers trying to take this fortress. We will still be here when you give up and leave." It was a challenge, a dare, and a threat all at once. For 3 days, the Allies had thrown everything they had at the fortress. British destroyers unleashed 500 shells, but the concrete shrugged them off. American generals wanted to bomb it into dust, but Dutch civilians still lived just yards away, too close for comfort, too close for conscience. So the Canadians tried again and again to storm the walls, and every time the ground was left littered with bodies and broken dreams. This wasn't just a battle for a patch of land. It was a showdown between two kinds of determination: the iron will of a German officer who refused to surrender, and the desperate resolve of Allied soldiers who knew that every hour of delay meant more lives lost, more families shattered, and the fate of the entire war hanging in the balance. But as the rain hammered down and the wind howled across the trenches, one man, Major Jack Morrison, was already searching for a different answer. He wasn't thinking about more bombs or more bodies. He was looking at the sea, the tides, and the fortress itself, searching for a way to break the deadlock without sending another soldier to die. And what he discovered would change the course of the war and military history forever. The fortress at the edge of the North Sea wasn't just a bunker, it was a nightmare carved in concrete. Built by Nazi engineers in 1942 as part of Hitler's infamous Atlantic Wall, this stronghold was designed to be untouchable. Its walls were 12 feet thick, reinforced with steel and stone, engineered to shrug off anything short of an earthquake. Every approach was covered by machine gun nests, their barrels poking out from narrow slits, ready to unleash a storm of bullets on anyone who dared to cross the open ground. Inside, Major Klaus Richter commanded his garrison with icy precision. He had 180 battle-hardened German soldiers under his command, and they were dug in deep. The fortress was stocked for a siege, 6 weeks' worth of food, ammunition stacked from floor to ceiling, and 3 massive artillery guns capable of blasting Allied ships out of the water from 15 miles away. Richter's men weren't just holding a position, they were holding the fate of the entire Allied supply line in their hands. The Allies knew it. American and British commanders understood that as long as Richter's guns controlled the Scheldt estuary, no ship could reach Antwerp. Every supply convoy was a sitting duck, every attempt to run the gauntlet a potential disaster. The fortress was a chokehold on the entire Western Front, and the Germans knew it. Richter's confidence was absolute. He believed his fortress was invincible. The first Allied response was brute force. British destroyers crept close to shore, their guns thundering as they unleashed 500 shells in a single barrage. The explosions lit up the sky, sending shockwaves through the ground. But when the smoke cleared, the fortress still stood, its concrete walls barely scratched. The shells had bounced off or exploded harmlessly, leaving only blackened scorch marks as proof of the attack. American generals pushed for a different approach, heavy bombers dropping 1,000-pound bombs to turn the fortress into rubble. But there was a catch. Dutch civilians still lived in houses just 30 yards away. Any bombing run risked wiping out innocent families, and Allied commanders refused to give that order. The cost was too high, the risk too great. So the Canadians tried what they knew best: courage and determination. The first infantry assault came at dawn, 80 men charging across open ground, hoping to catch the Germans off guard. But the defenders were ready. Machine guns opened up at 150 yards, cutting down 23 men in the first 90 seconds. 19 more fell wounded, and the survivors crawled back to the trenches, dragging their friends through the mud. Undeterred, the Canadians tried again that afternoon, this time using smoke grenades and covering fire. 60 men advanced through the haze, but the Germans waited in silence, listening for footsteps. When the Canadians were just 50 feet away, the machine guns erupted again. 24 more men fell in seconds. The third assault came the next morning with new tactics and more artillery support. The result was heartbreakingly familiar: more casualties, more wooden crosses, more families left waiting for news that would never come. The fortress had become a symbol of Allied frustration, a concrete monster that refused to die, no matter how much firepower was thrown at it. Every failed assault was a reminder that brute force wasn't enough. The Germans had built a fortress that could withstand bombs, bullets, and even the best efforts of some of the bravest soldiers in the world. But as the days dragged on and the casualty lists grew longer, it became clear that something had to change. The fortress was more than just a military obstacle. It was a test of imagination, a challenge that demanded a new kind of thinking. And while the generals argued over artillery and airstrikes, one Canadian officer was quietly searching for a weakness no one else could see. What he found would turn the entire battle upside down. Every hour the fortress stood, the cost in human lives grew heavier. The muddy Dutch fields around the stronghold were quickly turning into a graveyard for Allied hopes. For the Canadian soldiers in the trenches, the reality was brutal. Every failed assault meant more friends lost, more letters home that would never be answered. The sound of gunfire was constant, but the silence that followed each attack was even worse. It was the silence of men counting the missing, of officers writing names in ledgers, of medics working through the night to save whoever they could. The pressure on Allied command was relentless. American and British generals gathered in makeshift headquarters, their maps stained with rain and mud, their tempers fraying with every new report of casualties. The fortress was supposed to be just another obstacle, but it had become a symbol of Allied frustration, a concrete wall that refused to break, no matter how many men were thrown against it. The phrase "acceptable casualties" was whispered in meetings, but for the men on the ground there was nothing acceptable about it. Winter storms were closing in fast. The North Sea was famous for its savage weather, and everyone knew that once the storms hit, naval operations would be impossible. The clock was ticking. If the fortress wasn't taken before the weather turned, the entire Allied advance could be stalled for months. Supplies would pile up uselessly in Antwerp, and the front lines would be left to fight with whatever they had left. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Inside the command tents, the debate raged on. The British admiral, boots still clean from never touching the mud, insisted that more naval bombardment was the answer. "Bigger guns are coming," he promised, pointing at the fortress with his walking stick. "We'll pound them day and night until the concrete cracks." An American general standing beside him nodded in agreement. "Acceptable casualties," he repeated. "Send another wave, eventually their defenses will break." But the Canadian officers listening to these plans felt sick. They'd seen what happened when men charged across open ground. They'd watched friends fall, heard the screams, and written the letters home. More artillery, more infantry, more bodies, none of it had worked so far. The so-called proper way was just a recipe for more graves. And time was running out. In just 48 hours, the first winter storm would hit the coast. After that, the fortress would be untouchable until spring. Every day of delay meant 4,000 tons of supplies stuck in warehouses. Every day meant more risk for the soldiers fighting on the front lines. The frustration was building, not just among the generals, but among the men who had to carry out their orders. In the middle of all this chaos, Major Jack Morrison stood quietly, studying a map spread across a wooden ammunition crate. He was only 29, but his face was weathered by years of hard work and the stress of command. Morrison didn't argue with the generals. He didn't raise his voice or demand attention. Instead, he watched, listened, and waited, searching for something everyone else had missed. While the high command debated artillery and infantry tactics, Morrison's eyes drifted to the tide charts pinned to the edge of the table. He saw something the others, a pattern, a possibility, a weakness in the fortress that had nothing to do with bombs or bullets. In that moment, as the wind rattled the tent and the rain hammered the roof, Morrison began to form a plan that would change everything. But before he could act, he had to convince the men above him to take a chance on something completely different. And in a war where tradition and hierarchy ruled, that was no small task. While generals argued and soldiers braced for another doomed assault, Major Jack Morrison was quietly charting a different course. Unlike most officers, Morrison wasn't a career soldier. He was a Newfoundlander raised on the wild Atlantic, where survival depended on reading the sea and respecting its power. Before the war, he'd spent 15 years as a deep-sea fisherman, battling storms, hauling nets, and learning to trust his instincts. Out on the ocean, brute force meant nothing. It was all about timing, patience, and knowing when to let the current do the work for you. That background made Morrison different. He didn't see the battlefield as just mud and barbed wire. He saw it as a living, shifting environment full of hidden opportunities. As he studied the fortress blueprints captured from a German engineer, something caught his eye. The stronghold wasn't dug into the land or hidden behind the seawall. It sat right on top of the wall itself, its foundation exposed to the tides of the North Sea. The Germans had built drainage pumps to handle normal rain and regular tides, but Morrison knew the North Sea was anything but predictable. He turned his attention to the tide charts, a detail everyone else had ignored. The Scheldt estuary had some of the highest tides in Europe. Water levels could swing 45 feet between high and low tide twice every day. Morrison's mind raced with possibilities. He remembered winters back home when ice jams blocked the harbors and he'd been the one to break them up with carefully placed dynamite. He knew how to use explosives not just to destroy, but to work with nature's power. As the rain lashed the tent and the wind howled outside, Morrison's finger traced a path on the map, from a damaged section of seawall, cracked by British shells, straight to the fortress's foundation. What if he wondered they could breach the wall at the perfect moment when the tide was at its lowest? The North Sea would pour through the gap, flooding the ground and eventually the fortress itself. Ammunition would be ruined, supplies destroyed, and the Germans forced to choose between surrender and drowning. It was a wild idea, one that no textbook or military manual would ever suggest, but Morrison wasn't thinking like a general. He was thinking like a fisherman, someone who knew you never fight the sea head-on. You let it do the heavy lifting. Fish don't fight the current, they ride it. Morrison realized he could use the ocean as a weapon, turning the Germans' greatest strength, their fortress, into their greatest weakness. He called an urgent meeting with his engineering team, 6 men who trusted him with their lives. In a cramped supply tent, Morrison laid out his plan, pointing to the damaged section of wall and explaining how the tides could be their secret ally. The engineers listened, skeptical at first, but as Morrison walked them through the math and the timing, their doubts faded. This wasn't just a gamble, it was a calculated risk, built on years of experience and a deep understanding of the sea. But convincing his own men was only the first step. The real challenge would be persuading the high command to abandon their obsession with firepower and trust a fisherman's instincts. Morrison knew he was up against tradition, rank, and the weight of military doctrine. But he also knew that sometimes, the only way to win was to see the battlefield through different eyes. As the meeting ended, Morrison looked out at the stormy North Sea and felt a surge of hope. For the first time in days, he believed there was a way to break the deadlock, one that didn't require more bloodshed, just a little imagination and the courage to try something new. And as the tide began to turn, so did the fate of the entire Allied campaign. Major Jack Morrison's plan was nothing short of revolutionary, a strategy that would have sounded insane to most military minds. But Morrison wasn't thinking like a general. He was thinking like a fisherman, and that made all the difference. Instead of throwing more men and metal at the fortress, he wanted to unleash the most powerful force on Earth, the North Sea itself. The idea was deceptively simple. Morrison had identified a section of the seawall, already cracked and weakened by weeks of British naval bombardment. If they could pack enough explosives into those fractures and detonate them at the exact moment of low tide, the ocean would do the rest. The water would surge through the breach, flooding the flat land between the wall and the fortress. And when the tide came back in, millions of gallons would pour straight into the fortress's lower levels, turning the Germans' stronghold into a waterlogged trap. But this wasn't just about blowing a hole in a wall. Morrison's plan required precision, timing the explosion to the minute, calculating the volume of water, and making sure the charges stayed dry and functional even when placed underwater. He and his team spent hours running the numbers, measuring the cracks, and mapping out the safest approach. Every detail mattered. If they got it wrong, the fortress would stand, and the Canadians would be right back where they started. Gathering the necessary explosives was a challenge in itself. Morrison needed 400 pounds, enough to shatter 8 feet of reinforced concrete. He and his engineers quietly borrowed small amounts from different Canadian units along the front, careful not to attract attention. 10 pounds here, 20 pounds there, nobody asked questions because everyone knew that engineers helped each other, especially when lives were on the line. The next step was a covert reconnaissance mission. Morrison handpicked 6 engineers who were strong swimmers and trusted them with the most dangerous job of their lives. On a moonless night with the wind howling and the rain lashing down, they slipped into the freezing North Sea, faces blackened with mud, and swam toward the damaged section of wall. The water was so cold it felt like knives stabbing into their skin, but they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that this mission could save hundreds of lives. Reaching the wall, they worked in total silence, measuring the cracks, mapping the terrain, and identifying the best spots to hide the explosives. Barnacles sliced their hands, and slippery seaweed made every step treacherous. But Morrison's years at sea had taught him how to move in the dark, how to read the currents, and how to stay invisible. After 90 minutes of painstaking work, the team slipped back into the water and returned to Canadian lines, shivering but alive, and carrying the information they needed to make the plan a reality. The next morning, Morrison presented his idea to Allied command. The reaction was immediate and fierce. The British admiral was outraged at the thought of flooding a Dutch town, even though every civilian had already been evacuated. The American general was skeptical, demanding to know what would happen if the plan failed. Morrison stood his ground, calmly explaining that the risk was worth it if the plan worked. They could take the fortress without losing another soldier. If it failed, nothing would be lost except a few £100 of explosives. The debate raged until a new voice entered the room, Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, commander of the entire Canadian Corps. Simonds listened to Morrison's plan, weighed the risks, and made a decision that would change the course of the war. "You have 24 hours to make this work," he said. "Use whatever resources you need. I'll handle anyone who objects." With the green light from the top, Morrison and his team sprang into action. They worked through the night, gathering explosives, waterproofing the charges, and preparing for the most daring operation of their lives. Every step was a gamble, every detail a potential disaster. But for the first time in weeks, hope was rising with the tide. And as the sun set over the stormy North Sea, Morrison knew that the fate of the entire Allied campaign rested on a single, audacious idea, one that would soon make military history. As darkness fell over the battered Dutch coastline, Major Jack Morrison and his team prepared for a mission that would test every ounce of their courage and skill. The plan was set, the explosives were ready, and the tide charts had been checked and rechecked. Now it was all about execution, timing, stealth, and nerves of steel. The operation began under a sky as black as oil, with the North Sea stretching out like a sheet of liquid night. Morrison's team loaded the carefully waterproofed explosives onto a small fishing boat provided by the Dutch resistance. The boat's engine was barely more than a whisper, perfect for slipping past German sentries without raising an alarm. Every man on board knew the risks. If they were spotted, there would be no escape, just a hail of machine gun fire and a watery grave. Morrison stood at the wheel, guiding the boat by instinct and memory. Years spent navigating the treacherous waters off Newfoundland had prepared him for this moment. He could feel the wind on his face, taste the salt in the air, and sense the subtle shifts in the current. There were no lights, no talking, just the quiet determination of men who understood that the fate of hundreds, maybe thousands, depended on their success. As the boat neared the damaged section of seawall, the tension was electric. Morrison checked his waterproof watch. 3:15 a.m. low tide would hit at exactly 3:47. That gave them just over 30 minutes to get everything in place. The team moved with silent precision, passing the heavy bundles of explosives from hand to hand, each man knowing his job by heart. They had rehearsed this operation over and over on dry land, but now, in the freezing darkness, every movement felt more urgent, more real. Climbing onto the slippery rocks, Morrison found the largest crack in the wall and shoved a 40-pound bundle of explosives deep into the gap. The concrete scraped his knuckles raw, but he barely noticed. Lieutenant Davies worked just a few feet away, placing another charge, while Sergeant Mackenzie wedged explosives into a vertical fissure that ran 8 feet down into the wall's foundation. Every second counted. The tide was still dropping, but soon it would turn, and the window for success would slam shut. With numb fingers, Morrison connected the detonator wires, double-checking every connection. The waterproof watch mechanism was set for 3:47 exactly. If the timing was off by even a minute, the entire plan could fail. Too early and the water pressure would be too high for the wall to break. Too late and the rising tide would start pushing back, sealing the breach before the sea could do its work. 11 minutes to go. The team scrambled back into the boat, hearts pounding, adrenaline surging. Morrison made one final check, then pushed off from the wall. The engine carried them to a safe distance behind a rocky outcropping where they could watch the results without risking their lives. The next few minutes felt like hours. The wind picked up, whipping spray into their faces. The North Sea slapped against the hull, restless and impatient. Morrison stared at his watch, counting down the seconds. 5 minutes, 4, 3, 2, 1. At exactly 3:47 a.m., the night exploded with a deep, rumbling roar. The seawall erupted in a geyser of concrete and white spray, chunks of debris flying 50 feet into the air. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like Niagara Falls compressed into a single moment, the North Sea surged through the breach, pouring into the land behind the wall with unstoppable force. 50,000 gallons of seawater rushed through every minute, carving a new path straight toward the fortress. The current was so strong that fish and debris spun in wild circles at the edges. Morrison watched, breathless, as the water spread across the battlefield, inching closer and closer to the German stronghold. The operation had worked. The wall was breached, the sea was on the move, and for the first time in weeks, the fortress was vulnerable. Morrison and his men returned to Canadian lines, soaked, exhausted, but alive, and carrying the hope that their daring gamble would finally break the deadlock. But the real test was still to come. Would the sea do what bombs and bullets could not? Would the fortress finally fall not to firepower but to the relentless, unstoppable power of nature itself? The answer would come with the morning tide. As dawn crept over the Dutch coast, the battlefield looked transformed. Where there had been mud and barbed wire, now a slow, relentless tide was creeping across the land. Major Jack Morrison watched from his observation post, binoculars pressed to his eyes, heart pounding with anticipation. The North Sea was on the move, and the fortress, once untouchable, was about to face a force no army could resist. First, the water was just a thin sheet, glinting in the early morning light. But as the hours passed, it deepened, pooling in every low spot, inching closer to the fortress walls. By 8 a.m., a 100-yard stretch around the stronghold was under a foot of water. By 9, it was 2 feet deep and rising fast. Inside the fortress, panic was spreading. Major Klaus Richter and his men had prepared for bombs and bullets, but not for the sea itself turning against them. Water began seeping up through the basement drains, at first just a trickle, then a flood. The German engineers fired up the drainage pumps, but they were no match for the North Sea. Designed to handle 5,000 gallons an hour, the pumps choked and died as 50,000 gallons a minute surged in. Richter ordered sandbags stacked at every door, but water pressure doesn't care about sandbags. It forced its way through every crack, every gap, unstoppable and cold. By 9:30, the fortress's main ammunition storage was underwater. 18 feet of seawater filled the basement in just 20 minutes. Artillery shells and rifle rounds floated, then sank, ruined by saltwater. The Germans' entire stockpile was lost, gunpowder soaked, explosives rendered useless. Even if they could dry it out, the damage was done. The fortress was now a fortress in name only. Desperate, Richter tried to radio for help, but the equipment sparked and died as water flooded the communications room. His final transmission was cut off mid-sentence. The Canadians have weaponized the sea itself. We are being drowned in our own fortress. This is not warfare, this is silence. Outside, Morrison watched the water rise minute by minute. By 9:47, high tide hit. The sea surged, waves crashing against the concrete, pouring through doors and ventilation shafts, climbing the walls as if the fortress was sinking into the ocean. Inside, German soldiers abandoned the lower levels, scrambling up staircases, water lapping at their boots. 6 feet deep in some corridors, 4 feet in the command room, there was nowhere left to run. At 10:15, Morrison spotted movement on the roof. German soldiers, soaked and shivering, climbed out through a hatch, staring in disbelief at the water swallowing their stronghold. More followed, until 80 men stood on the roof, faces pale with shock. Then at 10:30, a white flag appeared, a bedsheet tied to a broken radio antenna snapping in the wind. Relief washed over Morrison. The impossible had happened. By 10:45, the main door opened. German soldiers waded out, chest deep in seawater, hands raised in surrender. Their uniforms were soaked, their faces a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. They had expected to fight bullets and bombs. Instead, they had been defeated by the ocean itself. In groups of 10 and 20, 180 German soldiers surrendered to the Canadians, some crying, some angry, most just beaten by a force they could never have imagined. Major Klaus Richter was the last to leave, wading through the water with nothing but his dignity and his officer's cap. He handed over his pistol and looked back at the fortress, now half submerged. "You did not fight us with guns," he said quietly. "You fought us with the sea. I have never seen anything like this." For Morrison and his men, the victory was overwhelming. Not a single Canadian had died in the operation. The fortress had fallen not to firepower but to ingenuity and the relentless power of nature. The North Sea had done what weeks of bombing and bloodshed could not. And as the first Allied supply ships sailed up the now open estuary, bringing hope and fuel to the front lines, it was clear this was more than a victory. It was a turning point, one that would echo through military history for generations. The fall of the fortress sent shockwaves through the Allied command. Within 72 hours, the first supply ships steamed up the Scheldt estuary, their decks loaded with fuel, ammunition, and food for the advancing armies. Antwerp, the second largest port in Europe, was finally open. 4,000 tons of supplies began flowing every single day, fueling the American push into Germany and breathing new life into the entire Allied campaign. The war would rage on for 7 more months, but this victory marked a turning point, a moment when brains triumphed over brute force and a fisherman's intuition outsmarted concrete and steel. Military analysts were quick to recognize the significance. In the days that followed, every Canadian engineering unit requested copies of Morrison's detailed plans. Officers wanted to know the exact mathematics, how much explosive for different wall thicknesses, how to calculate tidal flows, how to time detonations for maximum effect. Morrison spent 3 days in a farmhouse, writing out step-by-step instructions, drawing diagrams, and explaining how to waterproof charges and build reliable timers. His methods spread like wildfire not just among Canadians but across the entire Allied front. By December 1944, British commandos were using similar flooding tactics against German bunkers on the French coast. They breached river levees at low tide, sending torrents of water into enemy positions and forcing surrenders without a single shot fired. In January 1945, Soviet engineers in Poland used controlled river flooding to drive German troops out of fortified towns along the Vistula. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Use the environment as a weapon, turn nature's power against the enemy, and save lives on both sides. For Major Jack Morrison, the aftermath was both triumphant and humbling. Lieutenant General Simmons promoted him to lieutenant colonel, giving him command of an entire Canadian engineer brigade. Morrison led his men through the Netherlands and into Germany, building bridges under fire, clearing minefields, and using water and terrain to solve problems that bullets couldn't. His reputation grew. Other officers called him the fisherman, a nod to the man who had turned the tide of battle with nothing but a tide chart and a fisherman's patience. But when the war ended, Morrison didn't seek the spotlight. He returned to Newfoundland, took up fishing again, and later became a harbor master. He rarely spoke about the war, keeping his memories private, sharing only when asked directly. To his neighbors, he was a good boss, a fair businessman, and a quiet man who had seen too much. In 1991, a bridge was named in his honor, connecting the mainland to a small fishing island. Most who crossed it never knew the story behind the name, the story of a man who had once defeated a fortress with the sea. Major Klaus Richter, the German commander, spent nearly 2 years as a prisoner of war in Canada. He was treated well, given food, shelter, and medical care. When he returned to Germany, he found his home city in ruins, his family scattered by the chaos of war. Richter never served in the military again. Instead, he became a schoolteacher, teaching history and geography to children who had grown up in the shadow of conflict. In 1962, he published a memoir, Fortress of Water, describing the fear, the shame, and ultimately the respect he felt for the man who had forced his surrender without a massacre. The legacy of Morrison's operation reached far beyond the battlefields of Europe. Military academies across the United States began teaching environmental warfare, how to use terrain, weather, and water as force multipliers. In later conflicts from Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan, American engineers would breach dams, redirect rivers, and flood enemy bunkers, all using principles first proven by Canadian fishermen in the cold rain of 1944. Even today, in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, both sides use controlled flooding as a tactical weapon, echoing the lessons learned on the Dutch coast. Every time a river is redirected or a dam is breached, the spirit of Morrison's ingenuity lives on, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a bomb or a bullet, but a new way of seeing the battlefield. The fortress had fallen, but its story was just beginning to ripple through history. The story of Major Jack Morrison and the fortress that fell to the sea isn't just a tale of WWII, it's a lesson in the power of perspective, and a reminder that sometimes the most American thing you can do is challenge the rules, think outside the box, and refuse to accept impossible as an answer. Morrison's victory wasn't about brute strength or overwhelming firepower. It was about asking a different kind of question, not how do we break through concrete, but how do we make concrete irrelevant? That shift in thinking changed everything. While generals and admirals clung to tradition, Morrison saw the battlefield through the eyes of a fisherman, someone who knew that nature, when harnessed, could be the greatest ally of all. He didn't fight the sea, he let the sea fight for him. In doing so, he saved hundreds of lives on both sides of the conflict. The fortress didn't fall because the Allies were stronger or braver. It fell because one man dared to see the world differently. This lesson echoes far beyond the muddy fields of the Netherlands. In every era, American innovation has thrived on the courage to question authority, to challenge the status quo, and to find new solutions to old problems. From Silicon Valley startups to NASA's moonshot engineers, the spirit of asking what if has driven progress and changed the course of history. Morrison's story is a reminder that sometimes the answer isn't more force, it's more imagination. Today, military academies and engineering schools across the United States still study Morrison's operation. The principles he demonstrated, using the environment as an ally, winning without unnecessary bloodshed, and questioning conventional wisdom, are as relevant now as they were in 1944. In modern conflicts, American forces have used controlled flooding, terrain manipulation, and environmental tactics to outsmart enemies and save lives, all building on the foundation laid by a Canadian fisherman who refused to give up. But the real legacy of Morrison's victory is even bigger. It's a call to every viewer, every problem solver, every dreamer. When you're faced with an impossible challenge, don't just ask how to break through, ask how to change the game entirely. Sometimes the solution is already there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone bold enough to see it. So the next time you hear about a breakthrough, a game-changing idea, or a victory that seemed impossible, remember the fortress that fell to the sea. Remember Major Jack Morrison, the man who turned the tides of war with nothing but a tide chart, a fisherman's patience, and the courage to ask a different question. Because in the end, history doesn't just belong to those who fight the hardest. It belongs to those who dare to see the world in a new way and have the guts to act on it.